Continuing now on Newsmax Prime with more on that New York Times story of two women accusing Donald Trump of inappropriate touching and unwanted kissing. Mr. Trump active on Twitter this morning disputing those allegations. One of his tweets reads, "The phony story in the failing New York Times is a total fabrication written by same people as this last discredited story on woman." And now Mr. Trump's legal team is demanding a retraction and is reportedly drafting lawsuits against both the New York Times and another newspaper, the Palm Beach Post in Florida, which published a separate story about another woman's claims against Mr. Trump. To talk more about this, let's welcome in a panel of hosts from Radio Road. First, from San Antonio, Joe Pags, host of the show with the same name, simulcast daily here on Newsmax TV at 6 p.m. Eastern. And joining us from Boston, the host of the Howie Carr Show, Howie Carr. You also see a portion of his show here on Newsmax TV at 4 p.m. Eastern. And completing our trio, Skyping in from New York City, a host on 77 WABC, Curtis Sliwa. Gentlemen, thanks for your time. And Curtis, since you're there in the Big Apple and Mr. Trump's career has been defined out of there, tell me what you think of all of this. An October surprise, the press totally in the tank for Hillary. Is there anything to this, Curtis?
JD, it just it reminds me of how much Bill Clinton and Donald Trump used to love to play golf together, because the bubble factor is in full effect. Whatever water the lech Bill Clinton was drinking, it seems that Donald Trump was drinking from the same water. They're like two peas in a pod. They don't know how to keep their hands to themselves.
Well, so we got that going, and it is interesting. It's interesting, Joe, that you do have this double standard. With Clinton, it was, quote, everybody lies about sex. With Trump now, it's to disqualify him for ever serving.
Well, it's pretty interesting because the lawsuits are being drafted and they're going to do everything they can legally, but there really isn't enough time to sue somebody or some entity. And I think the New York Times is willing to lose a lawsuit as long as they can get Donald Trump to lose the election. Very interesting about one of these allegations. It's 30 years old. The woman says she was cool with him, I guess, groping her upper half on the plane. That was fine. But when he decided to go down to my legs, forget it, I had enough. And 30 years later, I'm going to come out and tell my story. It doesn't make any sense. It really doesn't. You've got people who are making allegations of Donald Trump attacking them and groping them and sexually doing horrible things to them in public where everybody can see it, and nobody says a word for 30 years until he has a chance to beat Hillary Clinton, the establishment candidate, the media candidate, 30 some odd years later, or 10 years later, or 11 years later. The thing stinks to me. Now listen, don't get me wrong. I've got 5 daughters, a wife, and 3 sisters and a mother, and I don't stand for anybody doing anything bad to women. Don't get me wrong, but this smells. This whole thing stinks.
Howie Carr, our friend Ann Coulter, writing at Breitbart.com, said the Democrats were searching for another Anita Hill. Is this like Anita Hill to the 10th power?
I think so, JD. I mean, I'm not sure either how much fire there is under all this smoke. I mean, it seems like they waited until they have this video from last week of Donald Trump describing his MO or his imagined MO. And now all of these women are coming out and they're confirming the MO that we have audio tape on. Let's not forget they made allegations about John McCain in 2008 and a blonde lobbyist who was 30 years younger than him. They had to run a correction in, or what amounted to a correction in 2009. She was suing them. I mean, the lawsuits aren't going anywhere, obviously. He's a public figure. The New York Times has covered its bases under Times versus Sullivan, but that's not what it's all about. As somebody said, this is about destroying his campaign for president. And I find it ironic too that all the people who are so shocked and in high dudgeon about what he's done, these are the same people who said that Bill Clinton, when he was literally attacking women, Juanita Broderick accused him of rape. Those were described as infidelities, and sex. Everybody does it. Now Donald Trump is accused, not so credibly, of pawing these women or making lewd comments to them, and it's the worst thing that ever happened.
Well, maybe one of the reasons these reports have surfaced again is because, according to the latest poll from Rasmussen, Mr. Trump has pulled back ahead. The GOP nominee, 43% to Mrs. Clinton's 41%. So, Joe Pags, I ask you, is this just triggered by Mr. Trump and the fact that the left cannot seem to put him away?
Well, I think that the reason why he's leading in that poll that you just referenced, then you might actually see a bump. You're starting to see the residual from what happened on Sunday. He did a great job in the debate. He did an excellent job going after the Clinton machine. It wasn't even going after Hillary Clinton. It, for the first time, was the nation seeing somebody with well, in Texas we call them huevos, eggs, to go after the Clinton machine. And actually say, look, we're not going to take it anymore. This is what your husband did. This is what he got away with. This is what you've done. And suddenly WikiLeaks and Anonymous and everybody else who's got a computer somewhere around the world that has any access to anything the Clintons have done, they're dumping more information as well. They've got to go after Trump, and they're hoping to kill the candidacy with this latest stuff from the New York Times. What the Times doesn't realize is we don't believe the New York Times anymore. Has anybody ever heard of Jason Blair? Ever since that situation, the New York Times became toilet paper in my house.
All right. Well, we go from toilet paper to the Republicans that maybe that's what's going on, at least in terms of the House of Representatives. Curtis, we take a look at what over the past couple of days was called a civil war within the GOP. We saw a lot of Republicans renounce their support of Donald Trump, and yet some of them are coming back. And curiously, perhaps the ultimate establishment figure, John Boehner, with a word of lukewarm support for Mr. Trump, perhaps capturing how most Republicans in the establishment feel right now. Let's look and listen.
Donald wasn't my first choice. Right. Wasn't my second choice. For that matter, he wasn't my third choice. Right. But he's the nominee, and I'm going to vote for him.
So, Curtis, you have Boehner there saying he supports Trump. It looks like Paul Ryan now, after making all the noise, is somewhat getting back in line after the WikiLeaks talk about Catholics in the Hillary campaign. What's your take on that, Curtis?
I got to tell you, first off, where were the Kleenex? I would have thought Boehner would have been crying there and having to say that. Secondly, JD, you know what all these Republican establishment guys are saying? Hey, Cruz, Marco Rubio.
You know, there is some interference with Curtis's Skype. I'm going to have to move to Howie Carr on this, and we'll try to straighten out. I don't know, maybe the establishment got in there to interrupt Curtis's Skype feed. Howie, obviously I used to serve in the House, but the word used to be keep your powder dry. It was amazing how Ryan and others were feeding some of the stories, Ryan advisors feeding some of the stories allegedly to the Washington Post.
Yeah, well, you know, Ryan, as you know, JD, he was a big supporter of Dennis Hastert, the former House Speaker, who's now in prison for money laundering when he was trying to keep some of his underage male wrestling victims silent back in the 1970s. Here's this guy who said that Hastert was a moral and an ethical guy who's now in prison, as I said, in Minnesota. And he's coming down on Donald Trump. And then you had Arnold Schwarzenegger. Can you believe it? Arnold Schwarzenegger says he can't abide Donald Trump because of his failings as a moral person. I mean, the guy who knocked up his maid, who was also been accused of groping and harassing women. You had Bill Weld, the Libertarian candidate for vice president, the former Republican governor of Massachusetts. He's saying, well, I think Donald Trump may be sniffing something he shouldn't be sniffing. I mean, Bill Weld, of all people, I mean, a guy whose nose looks like Tip O'Neill's or Ted Kennedy's. I mean, he's accusing someone else of substance abuse. I mean, this was ridiculous. These Republicans or former Republicans going after Donald Trump on his ethical failings.
Now, JD, there's a lesson to be learned here for all young men who may want to run for the presidency in the future as a Democrat or Republican or independent, is that start taking saltpeter and eating those graham crackers at a young age so that you can control your libido. This whole election is about libido problems. Can you imagine this? I'm worried about health care. How am I going to pay my Barack Obama premium in the new year? It's skyrocketing, and we can't even talk about real issues because we're talking about the angle of the dangle of Bill Clinton, of Donald Trump, who's a rapist, who's a lech. This is crazy.
It sure is crazy, but we think
it's not going to change though. If they weren't going after, if they weren't going after Donald Trump on sex, they'd be going after somebody else on something else. I mean, look at Mitt Romney 4 years ago. He was Mr. Clean. I mean, this is a guy who never had any kind of moral failings. And what did they go after him for? He drove his dog, his Irish setter, to Michigan from Massachusetts on the roof of the car. So he was a guy who hated animals. He didn't pay his taxes. He gave the wife of one of his employees cancer. He had binders full of women. I mean, if it wasn't if Kasich or Jeb Bush was the nominee, they'd be going after them for something else. This is the modern MO of the mainstream media.
And gentlemen, we will have to leave it there. Howie Carr in Boston, Joe Pags in San Antonio, and Curtis Sliwa from New York City. Guys, we appreciate your perspective. We will have more on the Trump rally in South Florida right after this.